Hi there. Good evening. You've made it all the way in the cold, so I figure let's go ahead and warm up the room with our energy. Thank you all for joining us this evening. So Happy New Year and welcome. Happy New Year and welcome. Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Good evening and welcome to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. My name is Novella Ford, and I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs and Exhibitions. I want to thank you all for joining us here in Harlem as well as online on what is a cold, blistery evening, but it is never too cold for knowledge and for understanding what has happened in our past so that we can understand our present as well as we move into the future. If you want to share tonight's program with others to stream now, it's available to view online at our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Schomburg Center. And you'll be able to find a link to the video that should now be in progress. The Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture is an evolving site of Black history, culture, and collective power. This year, we will celebrate 100 years of being the intellectual heart of Harlem and a premier institution dedicated to the collection, preservation, and interpretation of archives related to people of African descent. I think that deserves a bit of a round of applause. We plan to bring you even more exciting programs and special guests throughout the year. Our centennial will officially launch on May 8th, 2025, with our newest centennial exhibition, and from there, we will celebrate the next 12 to 18 months with an eye on our collections, a celebration of Black ingenuity, past, present, and future, all the while eating and dancing in the name of Black joy, resilience, and being. I recommend that you sign up for our newsletter to stay informed and also to receive invitations to special events. Please visit our website at schomburgcenter.org for more information and for links for signing up for our newsletter. Tonight, we will welcome Dr. Jonathan D.S. Schroeder, a literary historian and lecturer at Rhode Island School of Design. Through his research, Dr. Schroeder discovered a first-person narrative written by John Swanson Jacobs, buried in the archives of Australia. Jacobs was born into slavery, like his more well-known sister, Harriet Jacobs, the author of the widely known Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. He is described as a radical abolitionist, sailor, and miner who has a life story that is as global as it is American. Jacobs' 169-year-old narrative, The United States Governed by 600,000 Despots, is the first half of the book by the same title, edited by Dr. Schroeder, who also provides a full-length 9-generation biography of Jacobs and his family. Dr. Schroeder will take us through his discovery and join Brent Edwards, who is the director of the Schomburg Center Scholar in Residence program, in conversation. We'll also have time for audience Q&A, and books are available in our Schomburg shop, and we'll have a book signing following this conversation in the Langston Hughes lobby out front. With that said, please welcome Jonathan and Brent to our stage.
Good evening. Is your mic working? Try.
Is my mic working?
Yes, it is.
Sounds good. Good evening.
All right. Thank you all for coming out and for waiting. It's nice to be inside in this brutally cold evening. But we're here to celebrate this remarkable publication and this extraordinary discovery of John Jacobs's narrative, with one of the best titles, The United States Governed by 600,000 Despots. I thought we should we have to start really by asking Jonathan to talk about the discovery. And as you point out in your introduction, it's not every day that we find a new narrative, an autobiographical narrative by a former slave. We have a relatively limited corpus of these narratives, and to discover something, not to mention one this significant, by the brother of Harriet Jacobs, is pretty remarkable. So how did you stumble upon it? How did it come about?
And you're completely right. I think of slave narratives published before the abolition of slavery. We have something close to maybe 100 texts. And one of the things that might come out this evening is that many of those texts were published outside America, though until fairly recently, scholars haven't focused on what that means to maybe the fullest extent. What can be said outside of America that people would be hard-pressed to say within America because of repercussions or the threat of retaliation? Of course, I wasn't looking for this narrative when I found it. I didn't know it existed, and nobody knew it existed. And the tale of how I discovered it in an Australian archive is kind of one of those strange twists that happen in your life that you don't really know exactly how it happened. I was working on Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, a work by Harriet Jacobs, John Jacobs' brother, and I was working on a completely different book altogether. This was a book about the history of nostalgia, and specifically the way that that term in the 18th and 19th centuries was nothing like what we think of nostalgia today. It was a disease suffered by people who had been forcibly removed from their homes. Sailors, soldiers, and people that were enslaved and stolen from their homes. I was interested in charting the history of how this European medical concept came to be used in the American world. And I was also curious, well, if people in these positions were subject to this kind of racist, classist medical diagnosis that assumed that some people were too emotional and not rational enough, and therefore if they were taken from their homes, they would suffer this mental illness, what did people who actually had that experience say about displacement? Harriet Jacobs, and now I know John Jacobs, came from a family that knew a lot about medicine. They knew a lot about the formal medicine practiced by white slave-owning physicians because they were owned by one. They also knew about the informal medicine that was practiced between enslaved people outside of the gaze of white slave-owning physicians. I was curious about Harriet's biography too, because I read in her, and actually I could show some slides and show you exactly the note that I found that led me to the discovery. Let's see if this works. All right, so I was reading Harriet Jacobs' biography, Harriet Jacobs, A Life by Jean Fagan-Yellen, and this footnote or endnote caught my attention because it says, Joseph Jacobs, Harriet's son, had moved to Australia and hadn't come back. And it was speculated, and the biographer of Harriet Jacobs speculated, that Joseph committed suicide or destroyed himself because she found a notice in a Melbourne newspaper. Now, I figured at this time, and this was October 26, 2016, which I will always remember because I was a nervous grad student trying to apply for jobs, and this was my way of burning off steam. I figured I could solve this problem better than Jean Fagan-Yellen could have in the 80s and 90s because she didn't have access to digitized materials. There's probably a digital database somewhere out there of Australian historical newspapers, and lo and behold, there's a big one called Trove, and so I started searching for the name Joseph Jacobs, but it turns out that a lot of people named Joseph Jacobs emigrated to Australia in the first half of the 19th century, and so for that simple reason, I said, well, what about Joseph's uncle, Harriet's brother, John S. Jacobs? Just because we know his middle initial, his name becomes a more unique identifier, a way that we can say, oh, this is the person that we're looking for in these archives. And so then I started searching around for variants of the spelling in case the newspaper editors misspelled it. And this is what I found. I came upon this huge, as Brent said, like really powerful title, this title that hits you over the head like a hammer. And I, all caps, at the time it said like 11,000 words, and I was like, there's no newspaper article, it's 11,000 words, this is something else. The second hit at the time was also the second installment of this amazing narrative. And yet, when I, apologies for going on at length, this is like, this is a longer story that gets longer each time I tell it, I suppose. I saw this title. I think I was taught to be masochistic in grad school, so I tried to conceal my excitement and be like, I don't know what this is. And because the byline just says, by a fugitive slave. So where's that search term, John S. Jacobs appearing, or John S. Jacob? So I clicked again nervously, and this is what I saw. On the left side, that's the first installment of John Swanson Jacobs's autobiography, which had been lost in an Australian archive since 1855. This is the April 25th edition of this newspaper called The Empire, which was kind of a liberal anti-slavery paper in Sydney that was founded by someone who would be instrumental in Australian independence. And then you have the second installment on the right. So where is the name John S. Jacobs? So I then skimmed through the first installment, and names that I knew from Harriet Jacobs's biography flew by. And I say biography, not autobiography, because Harriet Jacobs's autobiography was published in the US and edited by a white abolitionist editor, all of the names, the historical names of the people in her autobiography are replaced with pseudonyms. Here, in Australia, John Jacobs is he's naming names, whether it's the rich slave owners of coastal North Carolina, the pro-slavery politicians who were manufacturing unequal compromises between the pro-slavery states and the free states, so I was basically skimming through, and then I came across this note, 3/4 of the way down the first installment. And then, this is your like, aha, like, oh shit moment. Like, you're like, I literally, like, the breath is sucked out of me. Now, when I look at this note, though, and this will maybe transition into a broader discussion, when I read, "Sir, I have left you not to return. When I have got further settled, or when I've got settled, I will give you further satisfaction. No longer yours, John S. Jacobs." And like sidebar, like, is there a stronger but yet more polite fuck you than no longer yours that could be possibly said in this situation? Like, it's pure genius. And even the wordplay in the note is genius too. To get settled, that means you settle in a place, but it could also mean settle a debt that someone owes you. And who owes him more of a debt than Samuel Treadwell Sawyer, the congressman who owned him and also was the meager refuge that Harriet sought when she had to escape from an even bigger sexual predator and rapist, Dr. James Norcom. Sawyer became the father of Harriet's 2 children, but didn't acknowledge them or support them or even help them to become free. So when I look at this note, though, now, it retains its power, but I also think about the fact that in 1839, when John Jacobs escaped, walking out of a ritzy hotel in downtown Manhattan and going straight to Battery Park Wharf and taking a boat for Providence, and then making his way to New Bedford to work within the slaves' Gibraltar, or the fugitives' Gibraltar, for the whaling industry. When I look at this note now, I think in 1839 he did not write this note. He was unable to write it because that's what the laws of North Carolina forbid slaves from learning, was how to learn to read or write. They were not allowed to be taught to read or write. And yet, in 1855, when he publishes this autobiography, he writes it himself in a way that measures the distance that he had come in 16 years. And miraculously, it is this note that not only shows that John Jacobs became an author in his own lifetime, developed the rhetorical and analytical skills that are on ample display in this narrative, but also nearly 170 years later, it becomes the note that proves that this is his own autobiography that's been lost.
Wow. It's quite a story. So why that title? We have this startling title. What is he doing? It's so arresting, a title phrase. It's also such a striking contrast with the conventions of the genre, right? We think of narratives of the narrative of the life, incidents in the life, the way the autobiographical gesture of the former slave is usually framed. There are certain conventions that we expect. And this one leaps into an entirely different galaxy. So what's going on there, and why that word despots? What is this? What's the intervention?
So the United States governed by 600,000 despots, a true story of slavery. That title does not sound like what you usually title your autobiography. It does not sound like what other slave narratives were titled. 12 years a slave, 22 years a slave. A lot of very simple chronological titles like that. Or a title that alludes to the horrors and sufferings in bondage. John Jacobs' title sounds like a political pamphlet. It sounds like the kind of thing where you publish before you declare war. And in a lot of ways, that's how it should be read. It should be read alongside David Walker's Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. It should be read alongside plenty of Frederick Douglass, but I always have a fond soft spot for My Bondage and My Freedom, which I think is Douglass at his kind of freest. And very simply, 600,000 Despots refers to the number of slave owners in America. Or so I thought, and I was asked that question by Manisha Sinha, who's far more the historian than I will ever be. And she was like, there weren't that many male heads of household slave owners in America at that time. Do you think she's also including the families? Which is, I think she's 100% right, and that we have to think that that's also what he's doing. Because one thing that is so unnerving and radical about the narrative is that he calls out not simply the people I just named, not simply slave owners, pro-slavery politicians. He also calls out anyone who doesn't examine themselves internally to ask, am I in some way complicit in upholding the present conditions? And that includes all of the Northerners that he lectured to alongside Frederick Douglass or other anti-slavery lecturers in the 1840s in Massachusetts and New York and elsewhere. There he would say that if the law is the will of the people, the mirror of the people, then what the law is up to the people's decision-making, that they have a role in deciding what and how they should be governed. So that's the 600,000 Despots. To take on the revolutionary quality of the narrative and the way it is picked up in the title, I would say that an anecdote from My Bondage and My Freedom is useful for trying to see what Douglass, David Walker, Maria Stewart, Sarah Parker Remond, and John Jacobs, and many others, including Harriet, I would say, were trying to do. In My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglass talks about when he first started giving anti-slavery lectures in like 1841, and he's at an annual meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society, and one of the people on the board, a white abolitionist named John Collins, is sort of there off stage right after Douglass had gone on stage for maybe, the 80th out of probably thousands of times of his life where he told his life story. And he gets off stage and he says to Collins, I'm tired of saying the same thing on stage day after day. I don't want to be an object of slavery on stage. I want to denounce the people who make slavery a thing. And this abolitionist said, just give us the facts, we'll take care of the philosophy. And I think that kind of division within kind of anti-slavery humanitarianism was probably endemic. And the move to Rochester, New York in the late 1840s to found the North Star, to a move that brought with it a circle of some of the most important Boston and New York abolitionists, and in the case of Martin Delany, Pittsburgh, that was a move about finding the keys to publication that were not gatekept. This was a move to create the possibility of Black autonomous expression. I also realized while working on this project that it's also not an accident that Frederick Douglass is living next to the Canadian border, that he can say things that no one else can say, but also he can get to Canada in under 2 hours. That matters. If we start to think of that moment in Rochester, the moment that some historians call the moment of the Black capital of the 19th century, as a moment when Harriet Jacobs, John Jacobs, William Cooper Nell, Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, and others are all in the orbit of Rochester, all trying to devise a kind of radically frank, truth-to-power rhetoric to speak truth against power, then I think we get to an understanding of how you could publish this narrative with this title.
I mean, one of the things you do well in the biographical, it's worth saying that this is not just a single book. It's really at least 2 books in one, in that you provide the narrative, a scholarly edition of the narrative, but you also give a biography of Jacobs and really flesh out his life. One of the things that you tell us and show is the degree to which Jacobs becomes such a crucial participant in those abolitionist circles. Jacobs is in Rochester working with Frederick Douglass. You show those networks and show how Jacobs is a part of those networks. Now, somebody, My Bondage and My Freedom is the perfect intertext because it also is 1855, right? It's right in this period. Douglass, part of what has changed for Douglass between the first narrative in 1845 and My Bondage and My Freedom, his second autobiography in 1855, is that he's traveled himself to England and Scotland and Ireland and spoken internationally as an abolitionist. And he's also become a newspaper editor, as you said.
And he did allow 2 Scottish women to buy his freedom in 1846 too.
Right.
Yeah.
But Jacobs, one of the things that's remarkable about this story, and it's partly in the backstory of the publication in Australia that you give, it's partly not in the book, and so it's more in the biography that you give the bigger picture. This is, yes, a narrative of the experience of enslavement by a former slave. It's also a book about education. As you said, he didn't write that note, and it's a book about a determination to educate himself. It's also quite remarkable as a travel narrative. So Douglas talks about his trip to the UK in My Bondage and My Freedom. There are a few others, Nancy Prince or Equiano. There are a few others that have a travel narrative aspect. But this one, Jacobs is in Hawaii. He's in India. He's in Australia. He's in England. He's all around the United States. He's in California, participating in the gold rush. I wonder if you can talk about it from that angle, and it's partly to ask about the outer national aspect of that exilic perspective, to see the United States from outside the United States. That what does travel, what does that exterior, that outside perspective afford him in terms of the critique that the narrative ends up being?
And this is one of the kind of major questions for pertaining to why the thing that I really ended up doing was writing a biography of John Jacobs to accompany his autobiography. And it might be worth just saying one or two things about that. And that was really where I was wrestling with a bunch of questions which come from the fact that I'm a white editor inheriting this, what one scholar has called black message, white envelope structure for publishing the slave narrative. And so that really, trying to undo that history, which is a history of white abolitionists like Lydia Maria Child, who in many regards was remarkable, but she also made a lot of decisions about the publication of Harriet Jacobs' narrative that she didn't run by Harriet. She sentimentalized the narrative, and in my hypothesis, that means she took out a lot of the truth to power language that Harriet, too, was learning in the circle of Douglas in the late 1840s. And that's the kind of language that is hinted at because the original ending for Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl was supposed to be a chapter on the revolutionary martyr John Brown. That was cut entirely and replaced with the classic Victorian tearjerker scene of the children gathered around the death of a grandmother. We might also think of like the death of little Eva in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what I kind of learned also in trying to undo this history, which is also a history of the envelope around the narrative was published, the envelope part was inserted to say that someone had a good character or that they were otherwise credentialized, that they should be trusted. In a way, the language that surrounded the Black autobiography was supervisory language, trying to say to the reader, here's what you should be prepared for and here's why you should be listening to this thing. To think about how you might undo that kind of structure, I think I happen to be teaching Toni Morrison, and I think it's always good to be rereading Toni Morrison at many given times, but I was teaching Beloved, and I realized that what Morrison is doing is working with 19th century slave narrative conventions and structures. This is not the only thing she's doing, but it's one of the things. And she's looking at the ways in which the conditions for publication narrowed the world that could be narrated in the 19th century Black autobiography, narrowed it in ways that eliminated the broader world that makes up most people's lives, extended family, ancestors. Children are very important in ways that they're not in slave narratives. Ancestors don't appear at all for the most part, neither do friends, neither do extended families, neither does private life. because all of those things were said to be not worthy contributions toward the abolition of slavery by white abolitionists. And so if you read Beloved again, and Beloved is about an incident in which the way that that incident was narrated, Margaret Garner's murder of her children, the way that was covered in newspapers in 1854 so sensationalized and dramatized the event as to reduce it to a caricature that had nothing to do with what happened, nothing to do with the tissue of the world in which that event took place. Beloved fills in that world, fills in both that world diachronically across time, synchronically across space, makes that world seem big, all-encompassing, and you are lost and absorbed in that world so that you can understand the point of view and perspective for that led Margaret Garner to do this. That made it actually the right thing for her to do, despite what the laws of the nation say, despite how she would be thought of or treated or portrayed in the media. So I'm not Toni Morrison in any respect, but I do think the Black Arts movement of the 60s and 70s, in which all of these narratives were being republished for the first time, these 19th century narratives, that this is a way to complement and supplement an autobiography, not to supervise it or manage it or to say what readers should be thinking. This is an additional thing you can engage with, and also it's a remarkable thing to engage with because of the life that John Jacobs led. He lived on 4 continents. He worked on 4 oceans. In fact, he slept on board a ship on one of those oceans for 17 out of the 33 years of his life, meaning that was the amount of time he was on water, more time than he was on land. And you get to this one at one of these points where if I were like putting on an academic's hat, I would say it would be very difficult to say what is the relationship between this biography that extends beyond what is narrated in his autobiography. And yet it's clear that this status as someone writing outside of the scope and the boundaries of American law and humanitarian authority, that he was able to say all of this both because of what he learned in Rochester, New York, but also almost invariably what he's learning working in the gold mines, which is where a lot of kind of democratic politics is born grassroots, and working on board the ships of these oceans, that this is where he's also learning another kind of radical politics that is hybridizing with what he'd learned in Douglas's circle, what he'd learned in Boston before that with William Cooper Nell.
Well, it's really interesting to hear you talk that through, because it certainly comes through in the apparatus and the introduction and the biographical part of the book. What does it mean to edit otherwise? What does it mean to edit as a white editor without authenticating, without trying to frame, without trying to manage, without trying to take control? It's a very difficult ethical question, of course, practical question, because you're making choices about the way the book is presented. In a sense, what you do, there's one line in the Jacobs narrative, he says, "My father taught me to hate slavery, but forgot to teach me how to conceal my hatred." And in a sense, what you do is you supplement by fleshing out through the archives that rich biographical and familial history, that kind of life world that you were just evoking, and you show that. You have this amazing phrase in the biographical part of it, where you say that the Jacobses come from, so Harriet and John come from, you call it an intergenerational memory of the resistance to slavery. It's not just that Harriet Jacobs went up in that garret to escape this one predator. Their parents escaped. Their grandparents, it's multi-generations, and part of what you provide is you show that they come from that history of, we are not gonna stay, we are not gonna take this, we are gonna find a way out. And you do that through the archives. So that's invaluable. So that's not in Jacobs's narrative itself at all. Your biography shows us that deep lineage that they come from, which is a deep lineage of Black resistance. And it's a really inventive way of editing otherwise, I think.
And I think that's partly one thing that's really interesting is that John Jacobs's own revolutionary style consists of not narrating the sort of plot points of his own life. His revolutionary style consists of saying, we need to think about autobiography differently, especially if his expectations for what he should be talking about are just things that happened in public that can be eyewitnessed by someone else, things that happened to him or things that happened to people that he saw. Those are the conditions for writing autobiography that you'd find in like a courtroom. He didn't want to enter into that courtroom, so he stopped talking about all the events that happened in his own life. Even with some of his travel, when he comes back so after he leaves New York City, he signs up for a whaling voyage, and this is the route on the bottom left, that's the route of the whaling voyage. That's where he taught himself to read and write. All he says in the autobiography about this 4-year period of his life, though, is, I'm not going to tell you any fishing stories. And he says that because he wants readers to pay attention to the way he's saying something, the way he's analyzing something, critiquing something, to the way that he's performing who he is. And just like I said that he couldn't write his note in 1839, but in 1855 he could, it's not just that he could write it, it's how he could write it. It's the fact that this is his performative style that he has developed in front of hundreds of audiences, in front of people who are anti-slavery activists, in front of people who are pro-slavery apologists. And he wants people to see that. But of course that means that from the mere pedestrian biographical standpoint, we don't know a lot about everything else that happened. Sorry, but that was a little bit off track from your question.
No, it wasn't. Just to add one more point for those who haven't seen the book yet, the last third of his narrative really is not autobiographical at all. As you point out, the second installment turns into a critique of the Constitution. It really is a legalistic, rhetorical argument against those 600,000 American despots. The book starts off, it doesn't just say the United States governed by 600,000 despots, a true story of slavery. It says, a true story of slavery, showing that brutality is inseparable from slavery, that the Constitution of the United States of America is the bulwark of American slavery, and third, that the only hope of abolition of slavery is in separation from the Union. So it's this radically separatist document that, as you said, becomes a polemic at the end, not a story of the self, but really a legalistic critique in this, ideology critique in this powerful way. Let me pull you back to what I think is the primary point of reference for a lot of us. If we know the name, really for you, it was your point of entry too. If we know the name, we know of John Jacobs through Harriet Jacobs. And the other interesting aspect, especially in what you do in the biography, is that you teach us to read these two books next to each other. Harriet Jacobs' Incidents, one of the most celebrated narratives by former slaves, and the narrative written by her brother, which actually precedes, that's what we didn't know, that he actually wrote his first before hers comes out in 1860. But in a way, you're teaching us to read these books together. So it's a very interesting, I can't think of another example in the slave narrative tradition that gives us this kind of intertwining You say at one point in the biographical part that the brother and sister, they kept missing each other. They kept trying to be together from their time as children in North Carolina, but then they're together briefly in New Bedford. They're together briefly in Rochester. They're together briefly in London. They're trying to find each other, and then there are these years of agonizing separation, but still a common project, a correspondence that keeps them united even over the miles and over the years. So what is it, if we're thinking from Harriet Jacobs, that a lot of people in the room, I'm sure, are familiar with that narrative, what does it do to put John Jacobs' narrative with Harriet's narrative? What is it, how do we read them, how do we think them together?
I mean, for one, it continues to expand kind of our sense of this world, which is a world that we've only been getting through Harriet Jacobs' narrative. And if we're just taking the autobiographies, it is really fascinating that it's not 100% surprising that to tell the truth about one's life, and if your sister or your brother is telling the truth about their life, that narratives would be braided together. But there's a lot more artistry to the way in which both of these autobiographies is braided together that suggests there's more going on than simply that kind of superficial, oh, well, they had a shared life during their childhoods and their adolescence. We all know, when anyone thinks of Harriet Jacobs, they think of the word the garret. They think of Harriet's spectacular performance of freedom, which consists of hiding in the attic or the garret of her grandmother's house for 6 years and 11 months, demonstrating her own kind of willpower, demonstrating all the capacities that racist Americans said that black people were incapable or less capable of, and also doing it at the tremendous cost of her own body, because after those 6 years and 11 months, she comes out with chronic mobility issues. But I think it also is amazing to read Despots alongside this, because as you see the narratives braided together, you see that John was thrown into jail to try to lure Harriet out of hiding at the exact same moment. John actually had intermediaries pass notes to Harriet saying, not that you would, but don't ever reveal where you are because it's just going to make the whole situation worse. And Harriet replying by intermediaries. You also learn that if we're talking about ancestors and extended family, the Jacobses grew up on the coastal waterways of North Carolina. Many of the men in the family were sailors, which is how they had escaped for many generations, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, but also how they were able to trick Harriet's owner, Dr. James Norcombe, into thinking that she wasn't in the attic at all, but that she had escaped to New York and was traveling between New York and Boston to elude him. That Harriet wrote letters, members of the family brought them up to New York because they were working routes that sailed between North Carolina and New York City, and then they mailed it from those locations, or they mailed it from Boston. They also did it because they were working out a strategy between them to bankrupt the slave owner, because they knew he was bad with money and was always in court to try to pay off his bills or to sue someone to get some money so he could pay off his debts. And so they knew that they weren't just tricking him or deceiving him with the letters. There was another game they were playing, which was they actually knew how the fugitive slave law worked. They knew that you actually had to pay officials to draft documents. You had to pay legal fees. And they knew that if they got him to pay the money to travel up to New York to set in motion these things, or travel up to Boston, they were slowly draining his wallet. And that would accomplish Harriet's goal. She wanted to not be owned by Dr. James Norcombe because he was, even among slave owners, awful. Even among slave owners, a prolific rapist. There's no sugar-coated word to say. And Harriet Jacobs goes out of her way to say this in the narrative. They accomplished their goal, which was to get him to sell her and her 2 children to Sawyer, which is the meager refuge she talks about. But once we start to see how these narratives are braided together, we see that the jail and the garret stand side by side, that we have to think about those things in conjunction with one another. We also have to think about gender. What does it mean to be a black man in this position or a black woman in this position? What does escape look like? What does a future look like? What kind of work could be done together to almost bootstrap oneself out of the situation? And I think that's where the autobiographies come together. If we look at their biographies, we do see, like Brent said, that in their free lives, Harriet and John could not ever spend time together, it seemed. The longest time that they lived together was a little over a year in Rochester in 1849. And partly the reason there is that for free black men who had made it to the North, hypermobile jobs were some of the best possible jobs that one could get. Working for a shipping company that sent ships around the world that sometimes for 3-4 years at a time before returning home. Some of the best jobs that were available to black women were the opposite, jobs that did not allow for mobility, that defined the house as, I mean, this is obvious, but, and everyone knows this probably indirectly or directly through the media you've consumed, but their biographies bring this out in stark contrast, that they missed each other because of the way that John was orbiting around the world so rapidly, whereas Harriet was largely in the Hudson River Valley working in the household of the author Nathaniel Parker Willis as a governess and nurse for his children and his wife's children.
Why don't we return? I want to get you to say a little bit more about that. You say at one point...
The last quarter.
Well, no, about the global slave narrative. You say at one point that we haven't yet learned to read the kind of book that this is, a global slave narrative. And I want to try to push you to say a little bit more about what that is. What is this strange, unusual object that you've edited and put in front of our eyes? What is a global slave narrative? What does that mean?
The best that I can say now is that I think that when you're educated in the US, and this, I don't know if this is changing, but at least based on my education, probably the education of many generations too, you're taught to think of slavery as America's original sin that America is making up for through the expansion of its democratic institutions and the supposed eradication of this original sin. Obviously, that's a myth in many ways, and it's easy to call it a myth. But what happens when you take off those kind of blinkers of ideology and start to say, what else about this myth is important to pay attention to? Well, it casts African Americans as passive individuals who are waiting around for rights to be bestowed onto them. And that actually doesn't fly with the course of, if you look at actual American history, you find out that after the Second Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was passed, upwards of 5% of the black population left for countries, the best known countries that people left for, and that's like 150,000 people maybe more, left for Canada or the UK. Those are the best known places. Henry Highland Garnett goes to Jamaica. Others go to Central America and Mexico. John Jacobs is not the only black man from America who goes to Australia. At best, I can find like 300 or 400 people mentioned in newspapers. In fact, incident that Australians remember as kind of their Alamo moment is an event called Ballarat, or the Eureka Stockade, where several hundred miners barricaded themselves into a makeshift barricade to defend against British colonial officials and to say, we want rights, we don't want to pay. It's sort of a Tea Party moment. Like, they don't want to pay different fees, and they also want rights, and they want reforms. Well, the British colonial officials let loose gunfire and killed 60 people in 5 minutes, which was such a horrific event within Australian history that it set in motion, or it's said to set in motion, years of pushing for democratic independence, for independence and democracy. One of the people that was the leader of the miners' rebellion was a black man from Baltimore named John Joseph, who then went before the Australian courts with the 13 other co-conspirators. And when he was acquitted, he was carried through the streets on the shoulders of the people of the other miners. There are lots of these stories beyond the borders of the US, and I think that through a combination of not looking for these things or not even thinking to look for these things, and the kind of affordances we have when historical materials are digitized, we're only starting to hear about them now.
Yeah. And as you say, part of what it's a tradition. It's not just an individual perspective. A part of what we're beginning to uncover is the intervention of that exilic perspective, that view of the United States from outside, the perspective from elsewhere, and the things that can be said only from elsewhere, only when you're not in the United States, partly for basic reasons of personal safety. I do want to open it up in a minute to questions and comments from the audience. I wanted to ask you to go back to the, or if you wanted to do something else, you can. But the frontispiece is what I wanted to ask you to say a bit about, because that's actually another part of the book, another essay in the book about this painting, which is quite a remarkable story in its own respect. So it seems worth just saying what that is and giving us a little bit of the story.
So the painting you see reproduced on the slide is what I am 99% certain is the only image of John Jacobs, but I'm also going to open up the room for doubt because it's an impossible question to ask, which is, how do you identify what someone looks like if all you have are just snippets of text that say that this person looked like this? This is a painting that's currently called The Man Holding the Liberator, which was William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery newspaper. And fortunately, on this paper, it says April 1848. And the painter was identified by an art historian who's probably the only art historian in the world to care about this, to me, very random portrait folk artist of the 19th century named Joseph Whitingstock. And she proved that he was in New Bedford in April 1848 at the same time that John Jacobs was coming to town to give one of his anti-slavery lectures. I think on April 14th, 1848, he and his co-lecturer got in a boat from Nantucket and sailed for New Bedford and gave talks over the next 2 days. John Jacobs was on the payroll of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was Garrison's society that year, so the association with the Liberator makes sense. And of the 14 or 15 other people that this art historian speculated might be the sitter of the painting, they were all pretty much ridiculous except for maybe William Wells Brown, except for William Wells Brown had a widow's peak, which we do not see here. And this, if we saw this in more color, you might also be able to think about historical hairstyles and how he's wearing his hair, which is kind of a combination of a Quaker beard and something heading a little more toward Douglas's hairstyle, which he wore in homage to Alexander Dumas. He wore unstyled or natural. And I think of this, identifying the sitter of the painting, as analogous to writing a biography of someone like John Jacobs, which is that even when you do as much painstaking research as you can, even if you spend years and years in the archives, it's arrogant and irresponsible to assume you know too much about the subject you're writing about. That it's important to recognize that the archives that we have of people that preserve some memories, some traces of someone like John Swanson Jacobs are problematic, and that they distort, erase, scatter the evidence of a life like this person's remarkable life. And we need to retain the fact that sometimes you cannot say what a person was like, or even say what the exact boundaries of their personality was. What you can do is say, this is the shape, the sketch, the outline of someone like John Swanson Jacobs' life, and it sits next to the words that he wrote, words that are quite remarkable, and I think we would be remiss to not quote a little bit of John Swanson Jacobs' own language, besides the it might be good to just read quickly the conclusion to Jacobs' narrative, which I think is some of the most rhetorically powerful and moving language that we have of his writing. And so you can all read, but I will try to read it as best I can. In conclusion, let me say that the experience of the past, the present feeling, and above all this, the promise of God, assure me that the oppressor's rod shall be broken. But how it is to be done has been the question among our friends for years. After the prayers of 25 years, the slave chains are tighter than they were before, their escape more dangerous, and their cups of misery filled nearer its brim. Since I cannot forget that I was a slave, I will not forget those that are slaves. What I would have done for my liberty, I'm willing to do for theirs, whenever I can see them ready to fill a free man's grave rather than wear a tyrant's chain. The day must come, it will come. Human nature will be human nature. Crush it as it may, it changes not. But woe to that country where the Son of Liberty has to rise up out of a sea of blood. When I've thought of all that would pain the eye, sicken the heart, and make us turn our backs to the scene and weep, I then think of the oppressed struggling with their oppressors and have a scene more horrible still. But I must drop this subject. I do not like to think of the past nor look to the future of wrongs like these. God save us from the blood of the innocent. I ask nothing more.
Wow. I think it's a fitting place to end and to open it up for questions. There are microphones in the back if people have questions or comments about this extraordinary book. And we have a few minutes for that, and then we'll go outside for a book signing.
Sure.
Well, I think it's because they're streaming. I think they do need you to use the mic. I'm sorry. Either one, yeah, that's fine.
Right. Just a clarification, because Australia, I may have confused a couple of things, had a color ban at some point. And I'm not querying, of course, any questions about the Aborigines, but I'm just trying to, you also mentioned the whole thing about gold and working in a gold mine. Mm-hmm. You know, I said, oh, I have the book, so I'm going to read it, but I just got it. Could you give me some clarification on this thing with Australia? Because I really thought that that color ban existed, but it also, things are different. It's like Cape Town and
Sure.
another part. So just, could you give me a little more elaboration on that?
And I think this is a great question to think through also, what does it mean to be an African ex-American in Australia, to have this exilic perspective, this outer national perspective. So when John Jacobs is there from 1852 to 1856, this is the moment when the British colonial governors are first proposing Chinese exclusion legislation. And China has its own, Australia has its own kind of caste system that John Jacobs was walking into and seeing develop. And I think that we can imagine that, like when James Baldwin in Stranger in the Village goes to Switzerland or goes to France and finds that the way that people are racialized, the way that groups are treated and hierarchized is different, that casts in sharp relief the way that America is structured. And I think one of the most remarkable archival finds that I found alongside John Jacobs' narrative is that 2 months before Jacobs publishes Despots in Sydney, a black man who publishes under the pseudonym Homo writes a couple letters to the editor, and he specifically says, here's why we need to not pass this Chinese exclusion ban. And he connects anti-Chinese legislation to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 in ways that suggests that this kind of internationalism or outer nationalism provides the kind of grounds for transnational, transracial solidarity in interesting ways. But what you're talking about, I think, happens sort of later. 1855 is relatively early in Australian history.
Mm.
Thank you.
Okay, all right then. Yeah, and I just wanted to make a quick comment. The whole internationalism does exist, and it's great that you were able to bring that in line in your analysis, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there other questions or comments? Go ahead.
Yes. Frederick Newsom from apartheid South United States. Thank you for your work. Do you think the story of the Africans enslaved in North America will have a happy ending or not? Can it possibly have a happy ending?
Well, you're making me now think of this amazing essay called Notes on Afrofuturism by Kadwo Eshen, and he says that what is interesting about Afrofuturism is not that it imagines a future, but it imagines futures that might disrupt the production of the future that dominant powers want right now. And so it's a really difficult question to ask, how can we imagine futures that would disrupt this present right now, not even the last 16 months, but imagine that compounded by hundreds of years longer. So I think it's too big a question for me to answer, but it's one that I'm probably going to be thinking about for the rest of the night.
Brent, do you want to try to answer?
I don't have an answer except to say that one way to read the narrative is as a meditation on this question of futurity and the prospect of ultimate justice. I mean, Jacobs is thinking about this, and of course these are part of these are some of the forces that drive him out of the United States. And that force him to start the narrative with that argument for disunion, for breaking ties. But But the book is, I will not forget those who are slaves because I have been enslaved. The book is about futurity in that sense. I was because we're literary scholars, I was very attentive to his use of tenses. And there are these amazing moments, back to what you were saying about the complex relationship with Harriet and the way their narratives are intertwined. There are ways that in the book, in the midst of narrating her predicament, in the past, he starts talking in the present. Like there's one point, I'll just give, so you'll understand what I mean. So this is the incident, she's in the garret. He's recounting that from a few years hence. Here the doctor seemed to give up all further intentions of trying to revenge himself on us for what my sister had done. 3 long years are past and gone, and my sister not yet free. She is still within 5 miles of the spot where she was born, seeing her master almost every day through the cracks of her place of concealment. There are these amazing moments when he pulls you back into the present of enslavement, even though they're both out of enslavement. It's really the connection with My Bondage and My Freedom is so apropos, because that's the problematic for Frederick Douglass too. I thought I was free. I thought I was out of it, and yet I'm still in it. My freedom is still a performance of bondage. I'm not yet out of it. I'm still enchained. What does it mean to be ultimately, to be finally, to be fully free? I guess that's just to say that question is in the book. That's not to give us an ultimate answer or a prediction from the present moment, but it's to say that one thing we can do in the present moment is to go back to a text like this as a meditation on this question that is still with us, that is still, that's this problematic that still bedevils us.
And we might want to think about, and I think the way that he startles with presence is really remarkable. He begins, if he ends that chapter by saying, here my sister is looking out through the loophole of retreat, the little gimlet that she has bored into the wall of the garret so she can see outside. That chapter begins, if I recall correctly, with, here I am looking through the grates of the prison.
Yeah.
Here I am. Well, that's not addressed, this isn't a historical narrative anymore. This is present tense. It's meant to take that reader and jar them out of complacency, and also jar them out of a sense of linear temporality into something else. And I think that is really, really remarkable. We might think about, if we think about, is there a future that ends happily, we can think about those loopholes of retreat that demonstrate what freedom might be like, that represent where freedom can be imagined and practiced outside of surveillance. And then we might think of that as also part of a larger act of refusal, because to refuse, as we know from many prominent theorists who've been writing about refusal in recent years, is not to just simply say no, it is to say no, to leave, to go away, to then practice something that you represent, that represents freedom or liberation for you, and then to return to transform the conditions that you rejected in the first place.
Yeah.
And so the garret and the jail might strangely, or maybe with a little bit of interpretation, they're both the prison spaces where freedom is possible for Harriet Jacobs and John Jacobs in America, and this is also their performance of that impossibility, and yet it is also simultaneously part of a longer process of imagining what it means to refuse America, but also return to it and reform it.
This will be our last question.
I want to ask you a question. I'm here with my 93-year-old mother, and she has deep roots from Edenton, North Carolina, going back to 1768 with the research that we have done along with Dorothy Redford.
Oh my God,
so,
wow.
When we discovered this book, she had a very strong reaction to what was being told even after reading Harriet Jacobs' story, but now hearing her brother's story, because we didn't know that this book existed either. So my question to you is, when you discovered the book and you were reading it, what was your reaction as you were reading his story and comparing that to what you knew about what Harriet Jacobs was saying about the town of Edenton and the people and the culture there? From your perspective as a human being, how were you reacting to that particular story?
I think that once I started to connect the story to the history of this family, which is also a contested history, because as anyone who's done Black genealogy knows, once you go back before emancipation, it's almost impossible to connect family members. I got really, really lucky doing the biographical and genealogical research because I found that the great-grandparents of Harriet and John Jacobs had actually escaped from Edenton and stowed aboard a Quaker captained ship along with their 5 children. This whole story is itself something that is keeping me fascinated researching the Jacobs family history, but that they made their way to New Bedford, and then they were harbored and supported by local Quakers in the area between Providence and New Bedford. And actually, they became embroiled in possibly the first fugitive slave case in America in 1794. What was even crazier than making this discovery was the fact that the depositions taken that are in the Massachusetts State Archives in the case file were meant at the time for the slave owner to prove property based on what his neighbors said about the people who lived on his plantation. But if we rub that kind of history against the grain, they allow us to connect the Jacobs family across 6 generations to the 1720s, when perhaps their first ancestors arrived after being transported probably from West Africa. And so once you expand the accordion of history and genealogy in this way, you realize Harriet and John were not the first to resist slavery. They were not the first or the second. As far as I can tell, they were the 13th and 14th family members to escape, whether to be recaptured or to disappear into obscurity, and that they were inheriting this kind of memory of, this kind of intergenerational memory of the resistance to slavery. I think Edenton is an important place here. I think it's interesting to think about how they knew this geography. Their father, Elijah, the father who taught John to hate slavery but forgot to teach him to conceal his hatred, he was a skilled carpenter who built, and much of his work is actually still preserved and in existence in the first Supreme Court judge from North Carolina's house, for example, in the cupola of the 1804 historic house in Edenton called the Cupola House. He had more mobility because of his skills. He was given a certain amount of, we won't call it freedom, but we'll call it freedom of movement, that allowed him to meet sailors, to share ideas, to come up with, hear about the different kinds of rebellions, failed and successful, that were happening in 1800 and 1802 in nearby Virginia. But I find it really interesting to talk to people who have deep family roots in that part of North Carolina, because a lot of people do, 10, 11 generations. And I also would love to talk to your mother and to you afterwards, because through a strange fluke, I now know the names of everyone who lived in that part of North Carolina in the late 18th through late 19th century. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for being an attentive audience. Thank you, Jonathan Schroeder. Thank you, Brent Edwards, for bringing us through this conversation. Please give them a round of applause. There's always so much more to know, and I appreciate the ways in which you all weave these stories together and help us to come back even to Harriet Jacobs' story, and reading those two things alongside each other, I think will be really interesting for those of us who will do so. With that said, Jonathan will be signing books out in the Langston Hughes lobby. The books are available in our Schomburg shop, which is right past the security desk, and we hope that you all will stick around to talk a little bit with the author. But if not, thank you for joining us. And just as a reminder that this Friday is Arturo Schomburg's 151st birthday, and we will have our annual lecture, as well as dessert reception and perhaps a short but lovely salsa dance party in his honor. So join us on Friday if you are available. Thank you again. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.